Okay, last week when we were there, when we were together, we actually began to look at the one single vision from chapter one, and that's really about the Lamb. And if I can kind of set this up again, it's really about seeing who Jesus is, and it's because it becomes a prerequisite. It becomes a prerequisite of of understanding chapter 2 and 3. So we kind of catch chapter 1, 2, and 3, for which we're going to do tonight, or chapter 2 at least. We'll get into chapter 2 with the churches. We must understand that the reason why we're kind of in chapter 1 here is because it becomes the keys to unlock chapter 2. Matter of fact, a lot of the reference points we're going to read now between verses 13 and 20 are going to actually come into play in chapters 2 and 3 as we see the 7 epistles written to the 7 churches there. So what we're going to do tonight for the first part is this. We're going to read 13 through 20. And I think where I was, help me out if I'm not, I think we began to talk about the description that Jesus gives to himself. Is that where we were? Verse 13. And in the midst of the 7 candlesticks, one like unto the Son of Man, clothed with garments down to the foot, and girt with paps, with a golden girdle. His head and his hair were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were as flame of fire. His feet like unto fine brass, as if they burned in a furnace. His voice as the sound of many waters. And he had in his right hand 7 stars, and out of his mouth went a sharp 2-edged sword. His countenance was as the sun shineth in its strength. Now, what we're going to see in this first part are some detailed descriptions that Jesus gives in self-disclosure. These are things, again, revelation of Jesus Christ. The main theme is he. I mean, not the Holy Spirit, not God the Father. I tell you, it's the one that was the rejected one that becomes the primary theme of the book of Revelation, which in fact makes it a proper title. When we talk about Revelation, we talk about revelation, the revelation of Jesus Christ, because that's really what it is. Okay, the revelation of Jesus Christ. So the detailed description follows. Jesus in this passage is robed. Now, all of these that I've dropped in the passage that you see are Old Testament references by which I told you on last week or last couple of weeks that to properly understand the concepts of Revelation, we got to have a foundation laid for us in the Old Testament. All of these things that we hear now in the passage, and I've done not an exhaustive thing, but I've tried to give you the verses that kind of become the bedrock or the basic verse for these particular descriptions. For instance, Jesus' robe. If you look at Zechariah chapter 3 and verse 4, and Exodus chapter 28 and verse 4, and 39 and verse 29, you'll discover that that robe part had much to do with priests, the priest concept, and how that even now we know we still buy into that idea. So when we look, the robe symbolizes the prophetic, priestly, and kingly ministry of Christ. Now, let me add a note here, and I didn't think about adding this one. Y'all remember when the text says in Kings that Samuel, that David danced out of his clothes? His wife said, "You look like a common person. You look like, well, you look like you lost your mind." Well, he really didn't dance naked. What happened was he danced out of the kingly vestment, this robe that we're talking about. See, when you wore that robe, it identified you as being priest, prophet, or king. And David had a robe that identified him as king, but because God gave him the privilege to move the ark back, and he began dancing after the 6th step. And the text said that Michal, his wife, saw him dancing to the point where he dropped his kingly robe. What she saw was embarrassing. Why he did it was because of reverence. Why should two kings exist? So why would he then wear a kingly robe, now being really in the presence of the King of Kings? You understand what I'm saying? So what he was not as important to him as it was to Mike, his wife. And so in that particular point, we began to see that this whole description in Revelation, here he is girt about the pap with a gold. He's clothed with a garment down to his feet. That's the robe. But then he's also girt to the paps. That's the King James version for chest, that chestly area, with a golden girdle. The golden girdle, the girding of the paps, the chest plate, was also mentioned, or is also mentioned in Exodus chapter 28 and verse 4, as what the high priest wore when they wore that, and they had the pomegranate bells, etc., on their chest. These things he did. So now he's not only occupying the place of king, as Jesus this is a self-disclosure of himself, but he's also adorned as the high priest, the ultimate high priest. And I think the Monday night's lesson, I didn't get a chance to tune into it all, but it was about the better high priest. And this, again, identifies him in this particular role. So the girding of this chest plate, high priest vestiture, would have been put. His head, though, is described, and this is where that one episode from Good Times, and they say, well, he like hair like wool, okay, that's Afro, y'all, so we're, so JJ painted a black Jesus, and of course it created a lot of trouble. But what we're seeing here is really something that if we go after it just for the ethnicity, we're going to miss what it's really saying. What it's really saying is that the head and hair like wool, head like wool, and then the color like white, really refers to him in a picture as not being new. He's not a spring. This is a depiction of the Ancient of Days. I think what's the singer? One of the gospel singers, McClurkin, has a song on the Ancient of Days, and it's been picked up. But the Ancient of Days really referred to his eternality. So when he said he's clothed with this, he's really talking about he is the pre-existent one. He is the one John writes about in the gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So as old as eternity is the Christ. Okay, even though he's born Bethlehem, he existed as the triune even before then, or the triune God before then. So, okay, eyes like flames of fire are depicting his ability to see everything. There's the penetrating power of perception. He sees everything and everywhere. There's nothing he does not see. There's no surprise to him, because these eyes like fire are really like judgment, but also penetration to the point of complete perception. You and I, I think we practice our best vision in the past, don't we? We said, man, I shouldn't have did that, or we should have did that. We got good vision on past stuff, but really, how good do we see in present? And we're not going to even talk about how good do we see in future, okay? Because again, we have a major problem. I think it's in myopia when we talk about short-sightedness. This eyesight of his self-depiction has to deal with his, again, superiority. We used to call it omnipotence, omniscience, and omnipresence. These are the omnis. He sees everything. There's nothing that goes on that he does not see. So again, these descriptive words are very important, because as these words are being written to the seven churches, remember, some of our pain, and I'll go ahead and sneak this one in, some of our pain and some of our problems in problematic times is we think he don't know. We think we got to tell him. And what God is saying is there's nothing I really have to be informed of, okay? Okay. Now, the feet like fine brass are strength and preservation and perseverance. The reason why they're depicted as feet like brass, every time you see that, like in the Daniel prophecy of chapter 6 and 7, is about these feet that crash. It crashes other kingdoms. He's solid. His kingdom has no end. Y'all excuse me just a second. So he has or possesses what we call tramping down power. Okay, so he's not tripping. He's solid. He's literally not going nowhere or cannot be pushed. So everything that he succumbed to is because he allowed it, not because they had power over him. Does that make sense? That even when we talk, as we're going to be talking now this week for the Holy Week, this week for the Holy Week, everything that happened, he happened because it happened because he allowed it to. Hence his breaking of silence to Pilate when he said, my life, I lay it down. In other words, no man takes my life. Okay. Now, and then finally, he uses the concept of his voice. The text says his voice. The text says his voice is as a sound of many waters. And what that was declarative authority. Remember that referring back to in the beginning was the word and the word was with God, John 1. Everything was made by him. And so when we go back to Genesis and discover how things were made, remember that everything was made was by the power of his voice. All he had to do is say, let there be. And whatever he said came into existence. So this is the voices of many waters is really referring to the declarative authority of the Savior. And so all of these things in terms of what he says will ultimately come true. Okay. So what the primary objective in the midst of this particular passage is what I'm trying to draw to verse 18 kind of quickly, is that in the midst of the candlesticks is his resolve. That's the theme. The theme is the revelation of Christ. Chapter 1 is telling us who he is. Chapters 2 and 3, he's in the midst of the candlesticks, which we are going to discover what that means. Let's look and see what it says. He gives to us a detailed description of what these are in the verses. I probably should have went on to the text says, and he had, verse 16, in his right hand 7 stars, and out of his mouth went a sharp two-edged sword. His countenance was as the sun shineth in her strength. This one phrase actually in the Greek refers to not only the sun, but the sun at its optimal point in which it makes it hard for things to be seen. Excuse me, y'all. Anybody ever had the chance of driving when the sun is like, I kind of hate that time of day when the sun is right at like the horizon. When it's high, it's cool because I got a sun shield over my sunscreen. But when it's on the horizon and I'm driving and I'm having to go like this, I pull down the shade. Have you ever tried to peer into the sun? This is what he's referring to as the sun that shineth in his strength. That, and when we behold him, think about what Moses encountered when he wanted to look at Christ. Think about the glory radiating off of God and Jesus that way. Here is the reference that I want you to check real quick. Matthew, matter of fact, I want somebody to read that. They give me a chance to kind of minister to this throat. I want you to look at Matthew chapter 17, Matthew 17. And I want you to begin at verse number 1, and then I want you to see verses 1 through 5. Can I get a reader? Stan, you got that? Okay.
I'll read, Pastor.
Thank you.
After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. There he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. Just then there appeared before them Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will put up those shelters. I will put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, a bright cloud covered them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him."
Now, what we have in the passage, thank you, Sister Bella. What we have in the passage is bright meets bright. Okay, this is the transfiguration. This is the Mount of Transfiguration. Here's the picture in the New Testament that Jesus is, here's the picture in Matthew's account of the Mount of Transfiguration, where it's kind of the key, if you will, to seeing what we just read in Revelation. When Peter, James, and John were allowed to see the transfiguration of Jesus, a depiction of Jesus breaking out of time and into eternity, is described as a great light. 2 lights are shown, both when the cloud came and the Father said, "This is my beloved Son," and then when Jesus embodied the glory, the glorified presence, his pre-incarnate state. The concept was it shined brightly. And that's why, again, you see the revelation, John here in Revelation referring to or actually writing what Jesus tells him to write. And that is that, again, he has this countenance like the sun in its strength. I mean, there's a time when I guess the sun gets into certain areas a little easier to look at, but when it's in its strength, you will do yourself harm trying to gaze upon it. Okay, so thinking in that same term is a description that kind of puts him in equal sense with God the Father. When God the Father was looked at, again, it was deadly lethal to look upon him. Moses hid in the cleft of a rock with God's hands in front of him and only the backside allowing to pass. And even when that happened, the countenance of Moses was changed. Okay, so these 2 things get us in the picture. Now, the detailed description, though, he has this 2-edged sword coming out of his mouth. He got 7 stars in his right hand. He securely holds the messengers. He has 2-edged sword coming out of his mouth, symbolizing the word of God and its penetrating power. And if you check Thessalonians 2:8, you can write these down. I'm giving them a reference verses so we can get to kind of where I want us to be. I want this to be a great backdrop for it. But when you begin to look at Hebrews 4:12 and 2 Timothy 3:16, Jude 1:9, you'll discover that all of these are the concepts of God's word. I mean, the power of his mouth. I mean, from us, we read a book. From him, the word flowed from his mouth. He was the incarnate, word of God. He's the walking epistle, if you will. Okay, so that being stated, Jesus's countenance was like the sun shining in full strength, the majesty like unto God's presence in the Old Testament. There we get in Matthew 17:2 and Acts chapter 9, verses 1 through 5. And of course, that's when Paul got arrested. Same image, y'all remember? Light shine. It stops everything Paul was about. falls off a horse, so much so that it blinds him. The piercing presence of Christ in Paul's day, when his name was Saul, going out to wreak havoc against the church, comes upon Christ and leaves him in a blinded situation. Now, and then we get the latter part of the verse that kind of gets us prepped to go into chapter 1. The latter part of the chapter is really about the fear and assurance. I want you to look at verse 17, because verse 17 kind of helps us to identify something that I believe, I know that most of us would get scared. Most of us would get scared if all of a sudden a darkness happened and you couldn't see, right? But would you also be kind of scared if a light happened and you still couldn't see? So it ain't just a dark. This is a mess you up light. Because again, when I saw him, here is what John writes. This is a personal concept. When I saw him, I fell at his feet as dead. And he laid his right hand upon me, saying unto me, fear not, I am the first and the last. Okay? I am he that liveth was dead. Behold, I am alive forevermore. Amen. I have the keys of hell and of death, and write the things which thou hast seen, and the things which are, and the things which shall be hereafter. And then we get a key that we're going to need to unlock a lot of passages in verse number 20, because this is why I'm kind of doing what I'm doing in terms of how we're reading. I told you that through the book that we will study, this book, the story will be told sometimes repetitively with an understanding that you picked up a few keys from the first scene. And tonight we're going to pick up some keys. We picked up the keys. We may not know what they are yet, but verse 20 is going to help us to see it, and it's going to immediately take place in the beginning of chapter 2. So here it is.
Okay, you have one hand up, Minister Salam.
Okay.
I kind of took it back down, but I'm working with a different device, so I don't know where everything is. But when you talk about the light and it's shining and a couple verses back, I just wanted to ask the question real quick, because on Monday, when I was in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3 talked about that Jesus being the radiance of the glory of God. Mm-hmm. And I referred that to, and it was the similar word that they use, doxa, for reflection. But when you're talking about Christ, he's the radiance, so he shines more brightly, more directly than the reflection that, like the sun reflecting off the moon, is not as bright, is not as deep, and is not as useful and penetrating as the sun radiating, like you said, through your windshield or radiating right at you. So I guess my question is, are we talking about a similar thing?
Yes, in times. Yes, in times, because when you look at, again, referring back to,
just as his radiance.
Yes, but again, you got to use the concept of time. Think about this. This is not that hard. In Matthew chapter 17, they went up with Jesus. They went up to the Mount of Transfiguration with Jesus, right? When he was disclosed and they got a chance to see what's under the covering, now it's blinding. So you can almost look at that radiant depiction out of Hebrews by saying that God made Christ, or, man, I hate to use it because of what we know, it's the hypostatic union, because we know, no, let me use the big words, here it is. Matthew chapter 1, verse 23 says, his name shall be called Emmanuel, which is being interpreted God with us. Yet the problem with that is that the people in the Old Testament knew that if God showed up, who could see him and live to talk about it? You understand what I mean? It's like, here's two things. man, if he shows up, I want to see him, but if I see him, I'll be no more. Okay? So here is Christ made a little lower than the angels for the suffering of death, but that we can behold the glory of God, which is what John writes, and we beheld his glory, the glory of the only begotten. So in other words, God does something like my driving car. Okay, I think I said it a few weeks ago. I got light sensitivity, so if I'm in bright light for a long time, I'm gonna have a headache. It's just I don't know what it is, but so I get these things that turn dark, so I can handle the amount of light that comes. So Christ was, Hebrew term, the radiant of God to as much as we could handle. But on the Mount of Transfiguration, he went beyond that, because what Transfiguration Mount was, that experience was a taking out of time into eternity. I don't want to lose anybody here, okay? What happened on the Mount of Transfiguration, Peter, James, and John got a chance to see Jesus in his pre-birth self with the glory. That's why Peter said, man, it's good to be here. I mean, because who want to back up in that point? But it was such a radiant heat, or not radiant heat, excuse me, such a bright illumination that it froze things. And most things are like that. I mean, there are hunters that hunt with a spotlight, because when the light is shining in certain animals, they freeze. If a light is shining upon us, we'll freeze. And here is what verse 17 says. Verse 17 denotes that the problem here, that when the light came, I mean, come on, now, here's what we have to interpret the white spaces. Why would he tell him, don't be afraid? Because he was afraid. And I don't think John is a punk. I really don't. I don't think John is soft, because I think any one of us were to see an experience of dark by ourselves, or an experience of light, and we thought it was God. I don't know if we would handle that one as cool as we think we might be. Anybody here would have a problem with an immediate exposure to something in the glory of God? I mean, because I'm gonna tell you, I want to make sure my stuff is right. You know, all this stuff. I mean, all of this stuff, because here is what I think the failure is, and it has happened. We've seen so many movies about God. We've seen so many things about God, and we've made God such a commonplace that I think, I'm gonna say this, Omika, I think we've lost the healthy fear of God. Can y'all identify what I'm saying? Okay. How many of you, by show of hands, had an old school parent? Old school parent meaning, and I would transfer, that you know they didn't take much and they didn't play, and they would I mean, they loved you. That's not, I ain't talking about an abusive parent, but I'm talking about a parent you learn either the hard way, or you learn because you were like me, number 5 out of 6 kids, that you I saw it didn't work for the other ones. I'm pretty smart. I know I ain't gonna try it if it didn't work for them. Okay, y'all got me? So the point I'm saying is, if you had a parent that was old school, you didn't play with them that way. You didn't. There were certain things. Oh man, I'm trying to see how I would say. I'm grown, but I wouldn't cuss in front of my daddy. I wouldn't cuss in front of my mother. Okay, it was a respect that I now have, but I do know definitely if I was 17 pushing 18, and I come out there and let a cursing demon have me for a moment, we having deliverance service right there. You know, she gonna beat the hello out of me. I mean, because again, let me just say, Gracie didn't play that. You know, I see it today, and that's why I'm saying we've dropped the level of respect. Now, I really didn't want to get to that yet, but we dropped the level of respect. We couldn't even say, huh, or to my mother. I mean, my mother and father required, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am. You do, huh? She said, what? And depending on how close you are, she said, what? Pop. And you never do that no more. You never do that no more. Now, translate that to this. Here is the image of God being shown to John, and John admits, when I saw him, I fell at his feet as dead. Translated, man, I thought I was going to die. I think because all of us are still we're still handling the process of God's complete redemption. I don't know if John may have done something, slipped down something, said, oh, he gonna get me on that one. But again, I think that mindset may be on all of our mind if he's to show up and say, okay, what is all of my business straight? Okay, because here's the text. He said, I fell at his feet as dead, and he laid his right hand upon me, saying unto me, watch this, fear not. And this is not the word Yahweh, this is the word phobia. In other words, I ain't getting you. I'm not finna judge you. I'm not finna kill you. Because as long as he feared, he couldn't function. Watch this. He's going to release him from his fear so he can do this function. He said, I am the first and the last. I'm he that liveth and was dead. Behold, I'm alive forevermore. A man have the keys. Now, I need to skip to 19 to define that function. He said, write the things which you'll see. See, if you're scared, you can't write. Okay? You ever tried? Okay. When we're scared, there's a lot of things we cannot do. So the first thing he does is handle the fear. Fear not, do not be afraid. And then he gives him the I ams. Here's the I ams of John's revelation. One, I'm the last and the first and the last. That refers to the concept of the beginning and the end, the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning of the alphabet, the end of the alphabet. Now, whether we know it or not, this is symbolic. It's going to come back up. So everything I'm using here, the only reason why I'm spending any time with it is that to each of these churches, one of these descriptions or another are going to be used to handle their right now dilemma. He said, I'm the first and the last. In other words, see, if you think somebody else got the last say, right? He's reminding you, no, I still got the last word. I had the first word, I got the last word. I got the first say, I got the last say. I'm the one that starts it. At the end, I'm not only the author of your faith, but I'm what? The finisher of your faith. So everything is folded down to his ability. So he's given him the I ams. And remember that the I ams, just a Jehovah's Witness point, the I ams are the divinative, are the declarative facts of God's claims to deity. Said another way, these are Jesus's way of saying, I am God, because nobody else says I am that broad, because you and I to say I am, for you and I to say I am, we got to fill in the blank because we ain't everything. He is so sufficient, he can say I am and leave the blank empty because he's whatever it needs, okay? So I am is his declaration to deity, okay? But he said, I'm the one that lives and was dead. I'm the one that lives who was dead, but am alive forevermore. Now, the third thing I think we need to see is authoritative possession. He said, I have the keys, not I'm getting. I have the keys. Now, this Sunday, Resurrection Sunday, all power is in my hand. We know that from Resurrection Sunday. But remember that John writes way after Resurrection Sunday, and this is a statement in the past of a past. I already have possessions of the keys of hell and death. Okay? Now, Hades, the place of the dead, and even separation, death, Thanatos, he says, I control them. Now, think about this. Think about this. How often do we get afraid of these two things because we forget he says, I got control of it, which means if I got the keys, it can't be opened or used till I decide to. And if believers ever really just kind of understood this, and that's kind of why remember that with the disciples, it's interesting that he's talking to John, because when he talked to Peter in Matthew chapter 16, he was telling them, Peter, in what kind of death Peter would have. And Peter said, well, what about John? And Jesus said to Peter, it's not your business how John checks out. I'm telling you about you, because what Jesus was saying then is, because I already know how I'm calling everybody home. I know how your exit, I know who's going to be translated. I know he knows all of those things. So there's nothing that happens outside of his authority. Okay, his approval. Does that make sense? Because I think too much, and so much he says in Matthew, fear not he that can just take your life, but he can take your soul too. So we need to see, and that was before Calvary, but now that he has all power, why would we fear anybody more than we feared God? Okay. All right, I'll move on. He says, 1, I've conquered death. 2, I control the grave. Okay. And he has victory of sin's punishment. Here's what he says. I'm living. I am he that lived and was dead. Behold, I am alive forevermore. Amen. I have the keys of hell and death. And so write the things which you've seen, and the things which are, and the things which shall be hereafter. Now, before we get this key, I want you to see the 3 things he talked about, because when he told them to write some stuff, when he gives them the assignment in verse 19, notice he's writing from 3 dimensions, okay? The assignment is to write what you've seen. That's the past, have seen, past. Write what you see right now. That's the present. And then he tells them, as if to suggest, I ain't finished with you. Write what will happen hereafter. That's the future. So John is enabled to see, of course, the past, but he's now given permission to write those things, whereas before those things were sealed. He said, no, write the stuff I have shown you, write the stuff you're seeing now, and then write the stuff that's going to happen hereafter. He's writing from 3 dimensions, past, present, and future. Now, that's the assignment that John has, okay? Just to write what he sees. And we told you before, the visual and audible events that happened, he got a chance to be enabled to, he was blessed to hear those things, okay? Now, so here's verse 20. Here's the last verse, and then we're going to go into chapter 2. Y'all remember how we read those verses and we found some things? What we're going to discover about Revelation, if you read Revelation, like I'm going to show you some things tonight that if you want to know where this means, all you got to do is keep reading, because it's as if in the second time he comes back and adds something else to the story he's told already. So it's a retelling 7 times of the same scene, not only in chapters 1, 2, and 3, but throughout the whole book. This whole thing, with each scene being detailed with some extra information, okay, from different perspectives, okay, particularly from chapters 4 to chapter 21, okay? Now, here's what he says in 20. The mystery, that word mystery, we get the word, Greek word is mysterion. It means something that's covered up. And now he's about to tell us, he's about ready to give us the key to what we've read. He said, the mystery of the 7 stars, just so that we don't have to guess, the mystery of the 7 stars, which thou sawest in my right hand, and the 7 golden candlesticks. The 7 stars are what? Everybody say angels.
Angels.
Okay, but guess what? These are not Michael and Gabriel angels. I'm going to show you that in just a minute, okay?
Those are leaders.
Yes, absolutely. They are the pastors of the 7 churches, or the pastor of the church as we relate to, okay? That's what it is. So It says the angel, because the word angel is angelos. It simply means this. It meant he that is sent. He that is sent. And you're going to always find in the church a key when we get ready to diffuse the first one, the definite article before the angelus word. You're going to always find the. And whenever you get the, not a, then some of you been with me at other churches where I talked about this. There's only one authorized angel at a church at a time. Okay.
So, Pastor, when you say angels, are you only referring to, because you got angel/messenger. So is that only referring to pastors?
In this particular point, it is. Okay. In this particular point. Now, when we start saying, because the stars he's referring to in the church was the angel, and that's why you're going to see the. Okay. But remember, okay, I'm gonna actually show you that. I showed you 2 verses where all of us are stars of one kind or another. Do y'all remember that from 2 lessons 2 weeks ago?
Yeah, that's why I was asking.
That's
you
right.
That question. Yeah.
In Daniel chapter 12 and verse 3, and in the book of Jude, we're either an eternal star or we're a wandering star. And I promise you, I got it up on the board, so it'll come. If you didn't write it, it's going to come. Okay. All right. The 7 candlesticks, and that's why we're talking about 7 and 7 now. And I'm going to give you that one too. I need to give you that one too. Okay. So the 7 candlesticks, he says in the passage, and the 7 candlesticks which thou sawest are the what? 7 churches. The 7 churches. Now, how many of you know, I told you last week that there were way more than 7 churches.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. There are a couple of churches, you know, that we can talk about, just name, we know that, but you don't see them. You don't see the, matter of fact, out of the 7 churches, if you go ahead and you see, you know, Thyatira and Pergamos and Smyrna and, you know, Laodicea, you ain't gonna find like church in Colossians, the church in Colossae. Okay, you're not, but that didn't mean that they were left out. I told you this was a circle, and since the number 7 is symbolical, there are certain things that we understand are going to be literal, and there are certain things that are going to be figurative, or figurative number, a figurative concept is going, or symbolical, I should say, is going to be this number 7, because the number 7 is complete. Okay, so it was really a letters written to all the churches, and therefore, even the letter to Laodicea would have been read in Ephesus. Does this make sense? Because if the churches were all receiving the letter all together, even though write this to this church and write that to that church, it was still applied, it was still read to all churches during this particular first century, which meant that the Ephesian church knew what was written to the Laodicean church, even though the Laodicean church had some issues, and so did the Ephesian church have some issues. I want to just be honest, nobody wanted Laodicean's problem, okay? Nobody wanted Laodicean problem, okay? I jumped ahead there, so forgive me on that one, okay? So it's all about the Lamb. It's all about the Lamb and the church. I'm going to go out. Any questions right now? I'm going to put up another screen. I'm going to put up another PowerPoint really quick, because I'm going to send everyone that one tonight, and I'm going to actually begin our part 2. Any questions? No questions? All right. So let me go ahead. It's up already. So. Okay, so you're watching what I'm watching. So this is Revelation, the 2nd week. Okay. Now, what I want to do, again, the theme is the Lamb among the churches. You'll make a mistake if you try to study chapter 2 and 3 outside of understanding the basic work we've just done in chapter 1. You need chapter 1 to understand chapters 2 and 3. Does that make sense? Everybody with me? Because this is the first segment. Okay. So what we're going to do tonight, Remember our lesson, our motivational passage, blessed he that readeth. We're going to read the passage, okay? We're going to read it. I'm going to go past that real quick because I wasted too much time. Listen, here's some key factors I want you to take over. Number one, Christ is the Lamb. Lamb is walking amidst the candlesticks. Christ is the Lamb. The 7 stars are the angels, are the pastors. Now, everlasting star, Sister Carmela, are they that lead others to righteousness, according to Daniel chapter 12, verse 3. So if you lead people to righteousness, you are a star, an eternal star, an everlasting star, right? Mm-hmm. But if you are leading people to wickedness and then you may shine for a moment, but Jude really refers to you as a wandering star, shooting star, which means your light is going to fade real quick, and in eternality or endurance, sustainability is not going to be your experience. Okay, you lose literally when you become a worker against God. Mm-hmm. Okay, the candlesticks, the churches, those are the keys. And the 7 is symbolical of complete or full. Okay. Now, here's how chapter 1, 2, and 3 tie. 29 verses in chapter 2. We've just read chapter 1. We're going to deal with 4 churches in chapter 2. 7 churches in all. These are kind of crazy because in one book you got 7 epistles. So when somebody else asks you about epistles, there's some just a little not trivia, but there are epistles within this book, because the epistle, these letters to the churches are in fact epistles. Okay, so the epistle of Ephesus, which we'll read tonight, we'll begin reading tonight. Smyrna, Pergamos, and Thyatira are all in chapter 2, 29 verses. Chapter 3 will have 22 verses with 3 churches, and of course we'll deal with Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. Okay, so tonight the goal is to look at each church through the lens of futurist interpretation. That's why I gave you that background and historical continuum, or historical idealist, which means how we're not looking at this just say, okay, what was then? We need to ask it, how did that affect that then? How did it affect the church in the first century? But the real thing and the carryover is that we got to ask, we're wasting our time if we study this and only say, okay, how did it affect them in the first century? We need to also say, okay, in a futurist perspective or an idealist perspective, what does this say to us today? Could we be making the same mistake as that in the first century? And so when we look at that, it will unlock it. Okay, I think y'all are ready to roll. So this is what we're doing. Okay, I need a reader tonight. We're going to read the whole chapter. We're not going to read the whole chapter. We're going to read all of Ephesus. I need the first 7 verses. I need a strong reader, if you will, to volunteer.
Got it.
And read verses 1 through 7, King James Version, if you will. Okay, because I'm teaching from that. And I want to show some certain things. Okay.
Unto the angel of the church of Ephesus write, these things saith he that holdeth the 7 stars in his right hand, who walketh in the midst of the 7 golden candlesticks. I know thy works and thy labor and thy patience, and how thou canst not bear them which are evil. And thou hast tried them which say they are apostles and are not, and hast found them liars, and hast borne and hast patience, and for my name's sake labored, and hath not fainted. Nevertheless, I have somewhat against thee, because thou hast left thy first love. Remember therefore from whence thou art fallen, and repent, and do the first works, or else I will come unto thee quickly, and will remove thy candlestick out of his place, except they repent. But this thou hast, that thou hatest the deeds of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. To him that overcometh, I will give to eat of the tree of life, which is in the midst of the paradise of God.
Okay. Now, when y'all see that word Nicolaitans, again. It's so, I think I'm gonna rewind that. I think I heard you say, because it might just be my ear. Did I hear
I said Nickelodeon.
Yeah, okay. I thought that's what I heard, but Nickelodeon's okay. I said Nickelodeon, they finna get ready to come on again, you know. Okay, but I got you. Okay, so here's what we're gonna do, okay? I promise you we're gonna read this whole chapter next week in this sitting. Go. Okay, to read the chapter was what one of our goals were, but we read the 7 verses, and we're going to read that which we taught. But the second thing was to get a study for the understanding. In order to get this, this is how we're dissecting. I want everybody to follow the plan, okay? The study plan is this. We're going to look at the 7 epistles with the 2 chapters using the specific church focus. In other words, we're going to read Ephesus. We're going to study Ephesus. Then we're going to, then we're going to look at Smyrna. We're going to deal with Smyrna. We're going, from those passages, pick out the things that were first century applicable and also transferable to us. Okay. So to do that, we shall note the salutation as to who they were written to. That's going to be pretty easy. Okay. But there's going to be a slight change in a few. We're going to have Christ's self-designation. And the reason why I push chapter 1 so fast is that he's going to explain, when we say a self-designation, this is what Christ says to John to write, and he's going to use a portion of chapter 1 for each one of the churches that we're reading in chapters 2 and 3. And he's not going to use the whole thing of chapter 1. He's going to say, here's the one who blank, blank, blank that he said from chapter 1. Okay, so we're going to see, what did he say to this particular church as to his self-disclosure or self-designation, okay? Then we're going to also look at Christ's commendation, because for most of the churches, I said most, there was something that he could commend the church with. I'm going to give you the note. There is one church that he has nothing good to say about. Nothing good to say about. Nothing good to say about, okay? He's going to have something good to say about every church except for one. And then he's going to also give condemnations. And he's going to have something bad to say to every church, but 2 churches. There are 2 churches he ain't got nothing bad to say about. 2 churches going to get all compliments and no condemnation. Okay. And yet these 2 are not being looked at as strong churches, but they're strong churches in his eyes. Okay. So then we're going to see the warnings and threats, because this is like, man, you better straighten up, fly right. Or was it straighten up and fly right? You know, he's going to give that crisis warning and threat. And I wouldn't, if we put that fear back right, I would not take the threat of Christ too lightly. Okay, well, man, his grace, he'll understand. I don't think that's going to pass. Okay. Number 6 is Christ's exhortation. He's going to tell you something in terms of, here's what I need you to do. I love the exhortation because he never tells us what's wrong without also telling us how to get right. We're going to see it identified in this first church that I'm going to actually begin, and I'm going to actually go about 4 minutes over to get us at least started with this one, okay? And then he's going to give us a promise. The promise for the overcomer. And that overcome is a statement you probably need to look at in the first one, because overcome, that word overcome is the Greek word Nike, okay? Nike, like our Nike symbol. And it really means he that overcomes despite an obstacle. He that overcomes despite an obstacle. He that overcomes despite an obstacle or an opponent, okay? Now, unto the church and unto the angel of the church of Ephesus, right? These things saith he that holdeth the 7 stars in his right hand, who walketh in the midst of the 7 golden candlesticks. Okay, you already got that one. So here's what I want you to understand about Ephesus. Ephesus was a wealthy, prosperous, magnificent, and well known for her temple. She boasted of having one of the wonders of the world with the temple of Diana. Diana's temple. How much can I drop in this few minutes? Diana's temple was not only a world wonder, but how many of you know that this concept of religion itself is very much tied to sexual activity. Okay, I'm gonna give you a point. Some of the symbols of our church is today are in fact brought on by some of the things that were considered value in the pagan rituals, like the steeple. You know, churches are known for their steeples, right? Am I talking in Greek? Okay, steeple. Steeple. Somebody describe a steeple. Take 5 seconds, 10 seconds, and just describe a steeple. I need 2 people just kind of tell me what we think about steeple. What do you see? Anybody?
It's metal.
Huh?
Is it metal? Made out of metal?
Okay, it's metal. All right, I'll take metal.
A steeple, it goes up into a point.
It goes up into a point. Who said that?
Sandra.
Okay, so it goes up.
Like
it goes
towards,
up to a point.
right. Like it's reaching towards the heavens.
It's
And it's,
reaching
it's
heaven.
magnificent.
And
There's one in DC that will blow your mind. It's like
Oh, it will blow your mind.
that one in have you seen that
Mika,
one in
I think you
Maryland?
know what I'm about to say, right?
It goes straight up.
Yes.
Okay.
That thing is gorgeous.
Without, Sister Donna, you got your hand up? Were you saying? Go ahead.
Well, I did, but everybody took my answers.
Okay, cool. Watch.
Sorry, I was too late getting on. I had to work, but that was what I was going to say. I was thinking of height, and I was thinking of straight up height.
Straight height. Right.
Up to see it.
Okay, let me see if I can get some help. Oh, Mika, you laugh real hard. Do you know where I'm going with this? Oh, Mika, do you know where I'm going with this?
I do.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Yeah.
Because it might sound better for her to say it than me to say it. But here it is. The steeple took its trait from the phallic symbol, phallic, F-O-L-I-C symbol, and it had to deal with the idea of being fruitful.
A-L.
I picked it up.
Okay.
On that.
Okay. I'm still talking high language to y'all because I don't know if y'all caught me yet. Because
Yep.
all that words y'all talked about
But it's
is that the higher the steeple, the more fruitful the place.
Right.
I'm trying to see how many of y'all trying to stop from blushing. Some of y'all turn y'all pictures off just right then. Okay. Now and these were the concerns. Now, why am I saying that? Because Diana's temple was magnificent, a high ridge place, but they actually practiced the love feast. Now, Ephesus is the city is wealthy because one is a seaport city. They got main thoroughfares. Every road that went to anywhere had to go through. I mean, Ephesus was a place. It had not only waterways, but it had roadways. And we understand how important traffic is, right? How many of y'all ever been to a town that only had one stop sign?
No.
Watch it. We basically talk about the largest of towns by how many thoroughfares they go to, right? So if on the front sign, on the front of the sign, the back sign, it said, "Welcome to Spotsville, USA," and then on the back it said, "Come back again to see us," you know that ain't big, okay? Ephesus had it going on because it had so many people, and Diana, the temple of Diana pulled that many people. I mean, because people believe if you want to have large families, Diana, you had to go. She was the one. I mean, the sexual. It had so many things in terms of the beliefs around the goddess Diana that here again the church is seated in the place where the temple of Diana is at. Okay, now Paul visited the city twice in Acts 18. That was in the second missionary journey, and then in Acts 20, that was in his third missionary journey. He visited Ephesus twice. Now that means it had, Paul came in to where the people at, everything was good. Now watch this. But Ephesus was also the place where Priscilla and Aquila were planted. Y'all remember those were powerful teaching partnership right there. And so I'm trying to show you how rich Ephesus came, despite the fact that it came up in a very pagan rich society. The church was approximately, at the time of this writing, about 40 years old. Now, she had survived. When she started, she was on fire, the whole 9 yards, in a city of paganry, the whole 9 yards. But 40 years later is when this letter comes. Now we can understand the tense of why this letter is addressing certain things. Watch what it says. First of all, the contact addressee is unto the angel of the church of Ephesus, okay? Unto the pastor of the church of Ephesus, if you will, okay? The counselor is designated in this particular passage. Look at the verse. It says, he that holds the 7 stars and walks amongst the lampstands. This is 2 things. He said, I got the messengers. I'm walking in the midst, which means this. Here's the translation. I know what's going on. Okay. If I'm there, there's a lot of times people don't know what's going on because all they see is from the outside perspective. But he says to the church, I'm walking, I know what's going on. And sometimes that's said to two purposes. Sometimes it's to encourage the other folk who get discouraged by, I'm doing all this and I'm doing it all by myself and nobody knows. He said, no, I know who's going on. I know what's going on. Could you imagine working at a place where you're working with 2 partners and your partners are doing nothing except when the boss comes by? But the boss does this and says, I put a camera in there, so I know who's doing the work. At this time, then it's good news for the one who works, but it's bad news to the one who thought that they were getting away with it, okay? He says, I know what's going on. Now, watch this. Here's the commendations. I want you to catch the commendations. If y'all can give me 3 minutes, I wanted to at least set Ephesus up to kind of get us through so that you will see how to do this as we go through it. He said, you've worked hard. I like this. He said, I know you've worked hard. In verse number 2, I know thy works and thy labor and thy patience and how thou cannot bear them which are evil. In other words, he commends them in verses 2, 3, and in verse 6. In 2 and 3, he says, you worked hard, you've been patient. The word patient means you've not just worked when everybody else was working, when everything else was going your way. He identifies Ephesus with the ability to work even when things were not going their way and they had to be patient. Because when you're patient, that means you have to endure even when it's going in opposite issues, okay? He said, but the church has performed many righteous deeds. In the next part, he said, here's another comment. You don't put up with sin in the church. In other words, you handle it. How many of you recognize that God's promise to us, one of the verses that are often misquoted, is that where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, I'll be in the midst of. You know, when we say that the most time I hear us say it is when we have a program and only 2 or 3 people show up, and we wonder, well, we just gonna go on because you know what, 2 or 3. That's not what Jesus meant when he meant that. And that's mentioned twice in Matthew 16 and 18. And in both times he's saying, if you get together and begin to handle the problems for which I've given you power to handle, when 2 or 3 are gathered together, I'll be in the midst. In other words, when you try to handle the problem, you got me. I'm there with you. You don't need me if you ain't handling no problems. Okay, the commendation to Ephesus is that they did not tolerate sin in the church. Wait a minute, y'all. How many of y'all recognize that this might be already on the toes of contemporary church? Because right now, not only do we tolerate, you do know toleration is the first step toward what? Participation. We tolerate it, we see it, okay, they ain't got away with it, we do it, we put up with it, now we start doing it, okay? So it begins that concept, okay? Third thing, they allowed only sound doctrine to be taught. This is a great commendation about the church. They only allowed sound doctrine. They said, you check those persons. You tried them, which say they are apostles and are not, which means you called them out and you held them true to the standard. The crazy thing about this one was, at the end of the day, they held people accountable on doctrine, but they had a problem with their heart. Okay, they suffered for Jesus, and they hated the practices of the Nicolaitans. Now, the Nicolaitans, we're not going to do a whole lot on this chapter because it's actually going to come up in another book. But I did put a thing on there about the Nicolaitan church, or the Nicolaitans, if you will. The Nicolaitans were a group of people who were not known, but they did stress two teachings. It's 8:09. I'll tell you what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna put a marker there. I'm gonna put a pin there, and instead of going ahead, I'll pick it up next week because I want to talk about the Nicolaitans then and the contemporary Nicolaitans, the concept of the non-tolerating and what happens. Because now, as we began to see, remember that what he tells this church of Ephesus to see and to do and beware of, he's letting them know what they've done good. But the problem here is that you can do a lot of stuff good and have no heart in it. Okay, I'm gonna deal with that next week. Let me pull my thing down because I'm over time, and man, time just go by. I really thought I'd be almost into the next letter, but we're gonna try to handle at least a church a week, if not two, since I don't have to go back and redo those things. Okay, all right. Let me stop the share. I went a little fast, so don't worry about that last part. I'm gonna redo the Nicolaitan part to show you what they have on next week. So again, chapter 2, verses 1-7, the church in Ephesus, and then we'll deal with the church in Smyrna. But Ephesus becomes a great model because if we can study this one and with this model, it will help us to depict all the other 7 churches, okay? Any questions? Did I lose anybody? I think I had 3 people that got off on the steeple story, so.